Great. Well, look, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, for that great presentation. We're now going to open up to questions, as you've heard, and I'd like to welcome Giles French to join us on the panel. And so far, we've had 2 questions from the audience, so that I hope that people will be thinking hard about what else they might want to ask. Let's start with that the question on Brexit that has been raised, not directly on the report. And although actually I really plan to throw all the questions over to the panel, this one I might just attempt a little response to myself. Of course, Brexit is another challenge, and the end of the transition period is another challenge for us. And of course, we will be losing some business as a result of leaving the EU, but this is an international connector to capital, and its business is not simply EU facing. It puts a greater impetus on us to work on our competitiveness going into the future, to work on those new trading arrangements, trading relationships, including developing our new relationships with our EU partners collectively and individually. As we look, in fact, at shared challenges going into the future, such as the challenge of recovery that we all face, such as the challenge of climate change. And indeed, I've been spending the last couple of days, at the end of last weekend, yesterday, in a set of virtual meetings with people in with colleagues in Brussels from the EU, but also from individual states, looking at what we should be working on into the future. Clearly, we're at a critical stage. I will just take this platform, as I would take any platform, to say that a deal would be much better than no deal, so that we can start on those conversations about the future relationship, or we can continue those conversations about the future relationship from a harmonious basis. But Brexit is just one of a number of issues, and we are absolutely confident that with London's fundamental strengths, provided we grasp our own future and take the steps that we need to make sure that London continues to develop, it is another issue amongst others, and we are very confident in London's long-term position. That's all I want to say. I don't know if any of the panel want to come in on that, or if we should move on to something more directly related to the report. I see no hands. Do signal, members of the panel, if you want to come in. Let's move on then to the question that we've had about whether we're engaging or proposing to engage with the construction industry. And I think Martin or Nick, that is probably for you, and then I might come to Giles on that as well.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, I mean, the question relates to the, let me just read, the engagement, appetite for bringing new practices. Well, I think this sits at the heart of what we're trying to say about the environment and sustainability. We have to change or radically challenge our approach to the environment and the way we redevelop the city if we're going to have a significant impact on climate change. I think that's very clear and everybody understands that. The opportunity to bring in some challenging targets that really address the carbon impact of buildings, both in their construction and operation, must question the way we use materials and think about materials so that we really value the use of materials. And that will inevitably mean looking at new materials, innovative materials, as well as working harder at how we can use things like timber that have a natural sequestration of carbon. There are technical challenges with that, but that is certainly something we're working hard on, and we would look to see the city promote through the planning process with new development.
Thank you. Did you want to come in at all on that, Martin or Giles?
I'm happy to add something. I mean, all I'd say is that we've had really promising initial conversations with the property and development sector, who are actually very keen to work with us on the implementation of the recommendations. So, I mean, we see this report as something of a roadmap. It's going to take, this isn't just about what happens immediately. This is going to take some time for us to work with the sector to deliver on its recommendations, but we've been very, very pleased with the warmth of the reception we've had so far, and I think I can say pretty confidently that the industry shares our ambitions.
And speaking from the perspective of the City of London Corporation, as the local authority for the Square Mile, we'll be looking at working with the construction industry as we implement our own climate action strategy, but we're also working to look at what we need to do with our planning functions and planning policies and so on as we go forward. So let me take as the next question the question around the actions which government and businesses should be taking now to ensure that this positive vision bears fruit. So who would like to have a start on that? John, would you like to come in first on that? Any thoughts on what governments and businesses should be doing now to make sure this vision bears fruit?
I think, Catherine, it really links to one of the other questions on the extent to which people are open to new ideas. And I think it's really a reframing of the construct in which we're looking at opportunity. So it's only when things stop working that you begin to appreciate the full, I guess, ramifications of why they stopped and how smoothly they worked previously. And the pandemic has caused, I think, people to rethink. We saw a switch to remote working. We saw businesses changing at speed, and we achieved more than we thought possible. So to me, the most important thing is retaining that sense of possibility of what can be achieved and to reimagine London, because we think we've shown we're able to change in a way at more speed and size than we ever thought possible before. And so retaining that sense of possibility, rather than what will be strong is that the DNA, the muscle memory kicks in to go back to how we operated before. I think we need to retain that sense of change. And in the report, we've tried to identify very specific areas where different stakeholders can come together to begin to drive some of that.
Thank you. Any offers from any other members of the panel?
I'd just say, building on that, I think the power of public-private partnerships is incredibly important, and specifically kind of given the velocity of change that we're seeing in some of the new industries that we're trying to attract, making sure that we have both the formal and informal communication channels open between enterprise and government to help drive the growth agenda in a safe and innovative way is incredibly important to both attracting and growing industry within London.
And I wonder if the panel would agree with me, during the response to the pandemic, I've seen closer partnerships than I've seen at other times. I've seen government, national and local, come together with business on, for example, the London Transition Board, which is another body looking at the response for London to the virus, or indeed working together on the London Recovery Board. And I think that's something we'll need to build on. Do you feel that society is more open to new ideas post-COVID? Anybody? I think we do need to be innovative. I mean, I would suggest we've seen people have to innovate because in order to carry on, and we will need to see that spirit continue.
I think that's right at the heart of all of this, and why we're excited about it, and why it's not just an incremental plan, but a reimagining London and that vision, because there is that window of the chance to change because of that optimism. I think that goes right to the heart of why we think this is so exciting.
Yes, John, thank you. Martin here. And I think that from a transport perspective, we've seen some really radical shifts, effectively, in many ways, just accelerating trends that there have been out there already, improved facilities for people walking, for people cycling, giving more space to people. Of course, some of that is temporary, it's experimental, it's related to COVID, but there are issues out there about closing roads to vehicles at certain times of day. There are even larger issues across the country, the way in which the rail franchising system has changed and adapted, or is being adapted, the way that we understand that government is looking at flexible season tickets for people. These are issues that have been effectively pushed forward by COVID, and this is a great opportunity as a result to move forwards.
I was just going to add, sorry, Catherine, I think we have all seen a radical change in our working experience. There's obviously a lot of debate about how that's going to impact on what our relationship between our home and our workplace is. And no doubt, there are very extreme views of it all being one thing or all being the other. We won't go back to the same live-work experience. It probably won't be as polarized as some people have speculated. I don't think the office is dead. I think the office is still a very important place in our lives. But I think we've probably learned to value it as a place that is much about education and about collaboration and about how we work with people and different generations come together, as it is simply a place that you come to. So the experiential factor of our engagement with the city and work is, I think, going to be much more fundamental to how we relate to the city.
Giles, what is the City Corporation hearing about people's wish to return to their offices?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I was perhaps surprised with when we produced the report was the sort of determination that people do see that they have an absolute commitment to central London. They definitely see the value in the agglomeration effect. They want to be co-located with their clients and their competitors. They see that's how they come up with new ideas and innovate. But that doesn't mean they're going to do it in exactly the same way they did before the pandemic. And I think we're definitely going to see, and we already have seen, an evolution in working practices. And we have to create the environment which enables that and strengthens that. I mean, there's no doubt it's been a remarkable success story how adaptable London has been in the last 6 months for those of us who can work from home. But I think the businesses we spoke to, I think most of them see that as a diminishing return over time. And you can't substitute certain activities with non-face-to-face engagement. So I'm not sort of dismissing the fact that things have changed, but I was struck by how much people still saw the benefit of coming together, bringing their teams together, learning from one another, and innovating, and that requires close proximity.
Thank you. So we're asked, what short-term actions should we be taking? This report is looking to the longer term. Any quick recommendations on short-term actions that the panel would like to see? John, what do you think?
Well, while the delivery of a lot of the recommendations and the impact ends up being longer term, actually the shorter term, there's shorter term actions associated with virtually all of them. And I think you can be on some of them, you can begin to see immediate payback. So if I think about some of the innovation ecosystems, the first one, bringing together that advisory group with different cross-sector representation to begin to drive that is important. There are various things in the infrastructure of working alongside the GLA, some of the emerging tech, the recommendations on the data side, some of the standards. All these things need to begin to build now, because there's the opportunity, we think, to start to put them in place, even if ultimately the change of behavior may come a little bit further down the road.
Any other short-term actions? Martin, Nick, thought, what would you like to see immediately?
Well, I think as you travel into London, you see already there's been dramatic changes in the streetscape. We've already started to redefine the relationship between the pedestrian, the cyclist, the vehicles. A lot of that is temporary, but that can happen very quickly, I think. And it's created things that might have taken a decade to change, have happened, almost overnight, which I think is really exciting. I think we've just got to build on that. I think we've got to start looking hard at how we set, meaningful targets across the environmental spectrum for all parts of the environment.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, Nick. And I think that what's been great is that a lot of London authorities and the Mayor and TfL have been looking to advance and introduce measures now in advance of, and partly to help with people in the current situation, but also to prepare for the world post-COVID. And preparing with temporary and experimental measures is a tremendous way, I think, of being ready and being more ready, I think, for when we can come back in a different way. And I think that the improvement in the public realm and the space for pedestrians and cyclists is a great thing to be excited about for the long-term future.
Lisa, any immediate steps from you to add to that?
I think I agree with everything that the other panelists have said. The only thing I would say is we need to think about the bodies in which this is taken forward. So there are existing bodies that exist. Catherine, you mentioned the Transition Board, the Recovery Board. We need to look at who's already addressing the recommendations that we put forward, make sure we're driving the recommendations through the existing bodies. Where they don't exist, we need to set up a new body that's accountable for driving these forward and making sure that we're putting the right resources and collaborating with the right people to get it done. This isn't about London just telling the other boroughs or the other parts of the UK what to do. It's about working with them effectively and learning from what they've done really well as well to take it forward together.
Thank you. I think that partnership point is a really important one, and looking at the bodies that have been set up and making sure we don't have an alphabet soup and that we've got something that actually is coherent. And you raise a couple of points I'd like to come on to in a minute, which is where business might play a part in this and also how we relate to the rest of the country. A couple of questions have been asked. Giles, I just want to check quickly with you, is there anything else you would add about short-term action and anything to observe on from what we're doing in the City Corporation?
I mean, only that I mean, I would echo what the others have said. I think it's about leveraging the existing structures to move quickly. I mean, you'll see in the report, some of the recommendations are about scaling and accelerating existing initiatives. And, you know, we're not precious about that. I mean, there's lots of excellent work going on across London about skills training, about digital skills, about diversity and inclusion. But I think the real difference is this alignment between public and private sector to get on with things, and perhaps some of the old impediments which existed, people are more likely to move out of the way, and I think that's what we would really encourage.
Thank you. Let's come on to the question of what role business can play in helping us achieve the aims of this report. And Giles, since you're right on my screen, why don't I come to you first on that question?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. As John and Lisa said in the presentation previously, I mean, we are capable of delivering some of this on our own, but we've designed the report very deliberately. We need others to participate and help us, and business is crucial for that. I mean, one of the things we saw, particularly when we were addressing how do we help the SME community develop and build their resilience in future, a lot of the things we heard, both from smaller businesses and larger businesses, was a desire and willingness to work more closely, to share good practice, to share ideas and training. And I think, yeah, so we would be wanting to work with the businesses from a range of sizes to help implement some of those recommendations pretty quickly. And we've had some private discussions already, and I think a lot of businesses in the city and central London are keen to play their part.
Lisa, any thoughts on how business can play a role here?
I think business will play a critical role here, as Giles said, and I think the partnerships with the government, as we've said, and also working to foster and create that innovative growth startup mentality is really important. So we're looking at industries of the future. How can London attract and retain the best and the brightest, both companies and individuals? And I think the companies that we attract here will be critical to that.
Thank you. John, anything to add to that?
No, nothing to add on top of what they said.
And
Martin or Nick, do you have any thoughts here? Goes back to the
I
question.
do think there's a real opportunity to try and create connections between, you know, large established businesses and the startup business, and you know, build those sort of linkages that allow them to collaborate. And some of that is a little bit of what we're thinking about in terms of the rethinking of what the retail environment might be, how to use some of those spaces as a way of curating and supporting those small, medium-sized businesses that want to come and be part of London or be part of the city.
Thank you. And we've talked about our aspiration to partner with other parts of the UK, and we have a question around how we see London's success helping other UK cities and how we can work together. Who would like to take a first shot at this question?
I'm happy to jump in.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John.
Catherine, I guess there are two specific areas that come into mind. One I mentioned in the presentation was the Lord Mayor obviously promotes London, but often beyond on overseas trade missions. And eventually, when he's allowed to travel again, those will go in person rather than virtual. And bringing other cities along on some of those trade missions is a specific recommendation. We'd suggest you promote London as a gateway, but we're bringing the whole of the UK. The second area we had flagged in there was mayors from other large cities are facing very similar issues. And is there a way to begin to convene them to share some of the thinking and the best practice on policy topics, on common issues they're fighting? And that could even materialize into recommendations to the government on areas like some elements of funding allocation, where the government decides how to do that. rather not necessarily disagreeing with the amount, but thinking of an alternative way to do that. Where the cities come together, they may be able to come to a better solution that works for all.
Thank you. Giles, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think this crisis has actually sort of seen a resurgence of sort of civic leadership around the UK, and I think from the work we've done previously, we already know that actually other parts of the country do see London as contributing to their success, as long as that partnership and relationship is approached in the right way. And I think, you know, this is an opportunity for us to make the case more clearly that London's success is not at the expense of the rest of the country, but also that London does have a responsibility to help the rest of the country with its recovery. And again, something which struck me when we were interviewing businesses for the report, I mean, time and again, unprompted, business leaders were saying that. And I think there is a real ambition and commitment from business leaders to make sure that the recovery is UK-wide and not just London alone. That's in our interest, and I think that the report provides a blueprint which is valuable for any major urban centre. So we've got lots to share with others, but we've also got a lot to learn from them as well.
So, Martin, Nick, or Lisa, do you want to raise your hand if you'd like to come in, and I will bring you in? Martin, I see no, I don't see. I see no hands raised. Come back later if you want to come in on that one. I'd like to move on to something which is actually really exercising me, and it's the question from Tony Travers. How should the City of London and other public and private institutions work to re-establish the physical presence of business activity and their employees in central London in the medium-term future? Is there a risk of significant productivity loss if London spreads out into a less concentrated version of a metropolis? And if a return to a concentrated downtown is a desired outcome, what policy steps will be required? And I have to say, I'm very concerned in the short term about the lack of footfall that we're seeing in our square mile, or indeed in the central activity zone, and what that means for some of the businesses that provide the vibrancy on the street, the arts and cultural organisations, the bodies which rely so much on footfall to thrive. What are the implications of this for the long term, and what should we be doing about it? So thank you, Tony, for asking that really significant question. I am going to start with Arup this time. Martin, do you want to come in first?
Yes, thanks very much, Catherine. I think there was another question about the 15-minute city, and I think that there's a lot to be said for the way in which our lives have changed in the short term, where we haven't been able to be in the city and we haven't been able to work in the downtown area, and that's been great. And I think that a lot of people are thinking a bit more about local travel, walking and cycling, which has been really good for health, and I hope helped some of the well-being issues that I know people have been struggling with. But of course, in the longer term, you know, I think that being in the downtown has the agglomeration benefits that John and others have mentioned, which is really critical. And I think perhaps that there is, to an extent, without wishing it to be too much of a sort of a cop-out, there is, to an extent, there is a degree of flexibility here, where we understand that we've talked about flexible season tickets, we talked about the way in which some people, you know, we'll be able to work from home a little bit more, or but of course, wanting to be in the city, those long-term agglomeration benefits means that being in the city as much, you know, is a very, very good thing for people, for the city, for everybody, I think.
I think I would add to that whilst there is I think a very strong desire to meet, to gather, to collaborate, people, I think we all in the periods when we haven't been able to come into the city, into central London, have missed that opportunity to engage. There is no replacement for the face-to-face interaction. That's the sort of spark of creativity, it's the spark of innovation. That doesn't happen in the same way over the digital process, however great it has proven to be. And that will always be a very powerful draw, but there is certainly going to be a rebalancing, there's a reassessment, and I think that for the quality of experience and the environmental experience that we expect both from when we go to work and when we're in the sort of, you know, the urban environment, is going to be, you know, really important. Otherwise it won't have that cohesive draw. And that is both just what you experience when you're walking down the street, but it also is about how we have to remember how valuable the cultural draw is, entertainment, the social interaction that comes around that, because that drives a huge amount of the 24/7 part of the life of the city. And it is that life of vibrancy of the city that for 300 years, 400 years has made the city work. That is not going to change overnight simply because of the pandemic. But we are going to find it will take time to bring people back, and that needs positive sort of catalysts and activity, and a lot of support from government and local authorities, I think.
I'd just add, I think Tony also asked about productivity, and I think sort of like to repeat what I said earlier about the value that businesses still place on sort of coming together and the agglomeration. And I think what you might see is that some of those activities in firms which don't particularly require you to be sort of 5 days a week, 9 to 5 at your desk, may happen more remotely, people working from home, certainly for a portion of their time. Although I suspect it's slightly overdone, the idea that people will work from home full time all the time, in fact some of the numbers which people suggest. But the real sort of added value, the creativity, the new ideas, the new products and services, the technological adoption, that will still happen when people come together. And I think I think that sort of productivity question, that you will still see the benefits of that agglomeration effect taking place in central London, but that will be accompanied by a evolution with the way that large businesses and small have their entire workforce deployed.
John, Lisa, do you have anything to add on this one? John?
I guess we've thought about this a little bit in 3 steps. I don't think it happens overnight. First is just needing to renew confidence in sort of that city center, right? And that's at an individual level, at an institution level. It's addressing some of the gaps Nick and Martin talked about on the infrastructure side. Then there's a second step, which is that new normal for prosperity, right? Which are some of the ecosystems we talk about, the workspaces, some of those changes that begin to get things driving. And that's both on the business side, but equally on the arts. We need that. And then the third step becomes that sort of future proofing, if you like, and where we go from here. Some of those bigger infrastructure upgrades, the fairer, more inclusive system, that they're laying that foundation for much longer term growth. And it links to one of the comments earlier on the short term versus long term. I think we've got to resist a little bit a focus on expecting to fix this tomorrow. If you look at Crossrail, you look at the extension of the tube, the impact, some of these really positive developments in London, they were 50 years in the planning and the making. And yes, we want some of the short term impact, but we can't take our eye off the ball on some of those longer term planning and investments that are going to be able to transform the city in the future.
Lisa, do you want to come in?
I think the other panelists have summarized it very well, but I would double down on the point of creativity, collaboration. I don't think those go away, and I don't think we move to a fully 100% digital world. So I think the steps that John's laid out and the points that Nick and Martin made are very well made.
And it's definitely something that we're hearing from the businesses that we're talking to, a real wish to get people back into the centre to yes, exactly that, so that the creative sparks can fly and corporate spirit can be developed. And Stuart Lipton makes an important point in the chats that the city is a wonderful place, but we'll need to work even harder, will need to be even better to attract people from their homes. Stuart, completely agree, and we will be focusing on making sure that the square mile is as attractive a place as it possibly can be, and we'll be working across the range of our activities, including with our planning, to look at that. I'd like to come on to some of the other questions. There are a host of questions around planning and transport, which I'll come to in a minute. Let me first of all take a further question about collaboration and learning, I suppose, and from Richard Burge. We've mentioned the elite universities, but there are also a multiplicity of innovative, small, specialised institutions in research and training. how do we bring the broad sweep of HE and FE into the effort? And of course, this is something which is replicated across the UK. We have wonderful centres of excellence across the UK with our great universities. Anybody wish to comment on the HE and FE sector? Lisa, would you like to come in on that one?
Well, Catherine, I think you already started to mention it, but saying we have broad centers of excellence across the country, and I think making sure that we're linking up with where we have centers of excellence and creating that positive feedback loop between what is happening in academia, what is happening in HE and FE, and translating that into business, making sure we have the feedback loop between private equity, venture capital, startup funding, so that these businesses are then able to establish root and grow in the UK, but they're supported by a safe, innovative regulatory environment that allows them to thrive. And so to me, that point is about all of these things coming together. And this isn't just about elite universities. This is about creating an entire academic system that develops the right specialists to feed the right industries, is supported by the right finance, capital, and regulatory environment that helps them grow. And that then also brings in the right people into the UK as well. So we need to make sure that the immigration system is aligned and allows specialists to come in to these academic institutions, remain in the country, and then grow and thrive and build their businesses here.
Great, thank you very much. Anybody wish to add at all to that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think it relates to the question Tony Travers asked earlier. If you look at how the Knowledge Quarter and the sort of fringe running along Euston Road from King's Cross, the Crick, through to Welcome and so on, how that has developed. And you know, a lot of that is to do with the triangle of rail routes up to Cambridge and to Oxford. It's building on the tech businesses that are related both to the relationship to the education institutions and the businesses that want to be located there, and it's the sort of symbiotic relationship with them. That is what comes together when you have a city like London, and I think that is really central to both for the large organizations, large businesses, large education institutions, but then all the smaller, innovative, you know, much more agile organizations that thrive off that, really. And it's the ecosystem that makes up the city in that sense that's really interesting. I think education is, we hugely undervalue the power of education, both locally but also on a global level, what a draw it is for to connect to.
Great, thank you very much. Anyone else on that? In that case, I'd like to move on to another question about sustainability. We've got a question saying that it was great to hear about the focus on sustainability in the report, and there's a nexus between regulatory levers, industry leadership and talent in finding new and better ways to deliver world-leading action. On the roadmap, what are the three most important contributors by way of action to make this a reality? Would anybody like to offer their thoughts on this? Nick, you're on my screen.
I don't mind kicking off, and then I'll let
okay.
then I'll let the expert say to me. I think this is a question from Sophia, who was a contributor to the report. So thank you, Sophia. I mean, I think the real big opportunity for London and the UK over the next 12 months is around COP26 next year, the big sustainability conference up in Glasgow, but also the Green Horizons Summit that the corporation is working on with government and the Bank of England. I mean, that's a real opportunity for the UK to show global leadership and commitment to sustainable investment. I mean, ultimately, all of these ambitions and targets have to be financed. And there is a huge desire and commitment from business to drive capital towards sustainable investment. And I think this period could be a real moment to realise those ambitions, because we need to invest. There is both because of economic situation, but also because of our climate commitment. And I think, that this is a sort of a potential for everything to align at the right time, and for London and the rest of the UK to really show the way, both not just domestically, but globally.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge to come up with what are the three things you put at the start of trying to address climate change. I mean, as a business at Arup, we have referred to the UN SDGs as a sort of fundamental reference point that we gauge almost all our work against, as a sort of central measure in a way. I think fundamentally one has to look at London to provide leadership. I think this is a place where London can connect with other cities across the UK to create an aligned approach to fundamentally how we change our attitude to the environment, and it has to be led by the local authorities, I think, and the government. And I think the thing at the center of it all is carbon. We can't talk about carbon enough, and the impact of what we do on the environment in terms of its carbon.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to come in on that from the panel?
Catherine, I'd perhaps add I guess three specific things. Sorry. One is, sorry, give me 1 second.
Just proving the importance of biodiversity, I think, here. With our
From a transport perspective, Catherine, if I may, just briefly to say, of course, there's a well-known quote by Jan Gehl who said that an endless number of green buildings don't make a sustainable city. And while that's absolutely, I hope, not intended to from Jan Gehl to denigrate any of the great work that Nick and colleagues have done and do, there is an importance in placing transport there in that low carbon environment. Hence, I think, walking and cycling as very, very low carbon activities to improve the role in which, not just health and well-being, but also our contribution to sustainability. And Central London has seen that: low car parking, very high levels of cycle parking, and a very strong mayoral strategy towards increasing walking and cycling.
Thank you. John.
I guess I'm sorry for the interruption. I guess on top of what the others have said, three things that I would stress. I think we have an opportunity to build on the momentum from particularly COP26 and the green horizons that Giles mentioned. One is defining and endorsing sustainability targets. The second is really incentivizing business to improve their sustainability. And then the third, again, that the city can run is helping to identify areas for shared investment. And those three together, just practical things we can put particularly onto businesses, but any of the organizations operating to help continue to drive this forward.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question around a little bit further about transport. There is a question in the Q&A around how we're going, the increasing walking and cycling and so on is great, but it won't deliver the same volume of people into the centre. How does that marry? How do we marry that sort of aspiration with our transport approach, with the footfall that we need in our central activity zone, if it's going to remain, a strong hub as it's been in the past? Any thoughts on transport and the conundrums here?
Yes, Catherine, thanks. I'll be happy to say a few words on that. The city's own transport strategy states something like putting the needs of people first when designing streets, and people, generally in the centre of London, they walk and they're able to cycle, and those are very dense modes of transport, and they can be allowing for COVID, thinking about perhaps more of a post-COVID situation. So I think that there, to an extent, I think that there really is a joined up strategy. I think the Mayor's transport strategy for healthy streets, for promoting walking and cycling, is helpful, and it does work. I know there's a lot of pressure, and there has been, of course, on the subterranean public transport and the rail-based public transport. And of course, we have to remember that Crossrail will open, I think the first half of 2022 is when that's now due, and that will provide a massive amount of extra capacity for when people think that the tube lines that they historically remember are very busy. Then of course Crossrail will make on the Elizabeth line, as it will make a huge amount of difference. So I think that there is a strategy in place, and I think that there are other opportunities, and we should be open to those things. Road user charging, for example, the way in which the congestion zone works and the ultra low emission zone, but perhaps there is a change for longer term change for an opportunity for road user charging again, to think about the way in which central London can place people first and the movement of people before the modes of transport, before vehicles.
Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts from the panel? Raise your hand if there's anything you'd like to ask. Yes, Lisa.
I was just going to say, I think I agree with all of Martin's very practical suggestions on kind of what specifically needs to change. I think ultimately this comes back to the first point John made around the reopening and making people feel safe. So I do think it needs to be combined with effective government communications around how the disease is spread, in which circumstances, and give us some fact-based upon which to make those decisions and to make commuters feel safe in their journey into the city. So I agree with all of those changes, but I do think it needs to be also coupled with effective promotion from the government as well.
Thank you. Any other offerings from the panel? I'd like to group a few of the questions on planning. We have a question, the specific question around the city, where we have a very small residential population, and we talk about making spaces more flexible. Yes, do we see the introduction of live work spaces for innovative startups a possibility, or do land values work against that? I'd like to widen that out a bit, and of course there is the emerging white paper, Planning for the Future. How do the panellists envisage the London Recharged report aligning with that white paper, and how can the aspirations of the respective reports work together to achieve the targets? And then there is also a question from Georgina from Hackney Council, saying that they were seeing the increasing creep of blue chip business activity into Shoreditch and further up into the borough, and how do we see demands for office floor space changing following COVID-19 and Brexit? So those are three actually probably completely diverse questions. Probably unfair to throw them at you all at once, but I'm afraid I'm going to go to Arup first of all to ask for thoughts on that. Nick, do you want to come in first?
Okay. Yeah, well, I'll take two of those points. I think Hackney is quite an interesting question. The sort of what the migration or the spread of some blue chip businesses towards Shoreditch and so on. Part of that is to do, I suspect, with availability of certain types of building stock that suit the size of those businesses and so on, because historically you would say that sort of as you move to the fringe of the city, you find smaller, more agile space that you may be able to lease on different sort of terms from maybe the larger properties in the centre. I think the other thing is, to Hackney's credit, I would say, is actually it's the experience, it's the interest, you know, the diversity of what Shoreditch or Commercial Road has been able to offer that attracts those businesses. Their staff want to be there. It's a funky place to be. You know, as London is made up, you know, the classic Abercrombie plan of London made up of the villages, and each village has its identity, is a very strong point, and the city is one of those villages in a way. So I think that will continue. The issue about what will change to the office environment, I think there's a lot of questions around densification. Are we going to keep chasing very, very high density office space, or actually are we going to rethink what that workplace looks like? I don't think that'll necessarily change the space take. I think it'll change the balance of how we use our workplace, and it comes back to the whole sense of well-being around the workplace. We'll want different things from the space we go to work for, and we go there to collaborate. We go there to meet, cross-generational, to teach, to train, to learn, as well as to do our business. So I think that is interesting, and housing is a question I throw back in a way to the city. I think it's for the city to influence and shape, but the city isn't one thing. It's very the square mile in the core, but there's a lot of other parts to the city that can very well lend themselves to live, work, and that mix of living and working that we're all experiencing.
Thank you. Who else would like to come in on that question? Martin.
Thanks, Catherine. I think it's very early days, I think, for the planning white paper, and there's a lot of detail in there that we will still need to see more of. For example, there's barely any mention of transport in the planning white paper, which is certainly very, very concerning when you think about the clear implications that transport has on large schemes. I think the planning white paper also has a large focus on housing at the moment, so developing that further to commercial spaces is very important too, and I think we'd like to see more detail on what that might mean. I think there is an implication, I think, of additional resource that would be required to manage the speeding up of the way in which that planning process, that planning system would work, and democratic accountability. So I think more detail needs to be seen on that one.
Any other comments from anybody? Okay.
I mean, only the thing that I'd add, Catherine, is that the point which Nick was making, that I think you'll see, I don't think it's going to be as simple as maybe businesses taking less space in future. I think it might be about how they use that space, how it's designed, how they might bring in other businesses or creative businesses into the same space. it feels like people are seeing this as a way of evolving how they operate and how they structure their business and the environment in which they operate. I think it's quite difficult for any of us to know sitting here today exactly what that will look like, but I don't think it's as it's going to be as simple as either the the same amount of space is taken in the same way or not. I think it's going to be a blended model in future.
At the panel, what I'm going to do in about 5 minutes' time is ask you to pick a question that I haven't asked from the Q&A, from the questions that have been proposed. Either pick a question that I haven't passed on from there, or pick a question that you wish you'd been asked, and I'll come to each of you in a few minutes asking for your final thoughts, perhaps along those lines. So, SMEs, we've talked about the importance of SMEs for the future and the importance of building resilience for SMEs. Of course, there is a challenge for SMEs in the short term, particularly those businesses that depend on footfall to thrive. And I think probably this report looks to the sort of next stage and rather than to what we should be doing in the short term about supporting our SMEs. But I don't know, Giles, if perhaps you want to come in and talk a little bit about the shorter term.
Yeah, thank you, Cathy. And I think there's sort of probably a couple of things to say. Is one, this report was very deliberately an attempt to look a little bit further ahead because we were conscious that most businesses and institutions in London were having to focus on sort of the near-term crisis which they were facing. So that was very deliberate. We are talking about a year or two out, out to 2025. But at the same time, of course, we understand for a lot of businesses, particularly in say retail, leisure and hospitality, services, this is an extremely difficult time, and no one wants to see the centre of London sort of decimated by the next 6 months. It's very difficult to say precisely what we can do, but some of the points that people have raised about how do we, when it's public health enables it, that we can bring people back into the centre, whether that's for arts and cultural engagement as well as workplace. I think all of that will help, but undoubtedly it needs a range of measures to support the short term as we see the emergence of this medium-term vision that we've articulated this morning. But we don't underestimate how difficult that is.
Any other thoughts from the panel on SMEs? Okay, are people ready to give us the questions that they wish they'd been asked? Lisa, why don't I go to you first? You're nodding. Thank you.
Sure, so thank you. So there was a question in the chat around kind of government support and how long will that continue? And I think, obviously over the past 6 months, there's been unprecedented government intervention into the economy and into our personal lives. I think through C bills, B bills, Eat Out to Help Out, CJRS, the initial interventions were necessarily blunt given the timescales that we saw. I think now government is very proactively looking at what are the future areas that will require support, what will happen if we end government schemes now or evolve those over the long period to support new kind of interventions that will be required. As the interventions become more targeted, either by region or by sector or by type of population, I think we'll see the government start to act in a more specific manner than they have previously and aligned to the restrictions that citizens are facing and the challenges that businesses are facing in each area. So to answer the question directly, I don't see this as a short-term government intervention, and I think that the government will continue to act over the long term, but that will happen in a much more targeted and necessarily focused area than it has previously, and it won't necessarily happen on the broad national scales that we have seen. And so what we're looking to do and what we're looking for government to do as we evolve that is make sure that we're helping businesses and communities that need the help most, and we're making sure that those that are most vulnerable are protected and supported, both from a personal well-being perspective, from a health perspective, but also from an economic perspective. So saving lives, but also kind of saving the livelihoods of people that are working in the UK.
Thank you. Who would like to come in next? Nick, what would your question be that you haven't been?
Well, Interesting end to our conversation. I would like to sort of talk, I think if we'd been asked about how do you put this into action, and I think the question is one about the sort of leadership from local governments. You know, this, I think this, you have enough opportunity with an agility at the local level that maybe doesn't exist at national level. But I think it needs an alliance across London between boroughs, and also an alliance with the key stakeholders in the built environment and the urban environment. So that's both the sort of institutional stakeholders, but also the businesses, to actually come together and set the, you know, really set some very ambitious targets and commit to achieving them in terms of changing the city. And we, you know, we have a once in a lifetime opportunity to really reset our relationship to the urban environment that can transform, you know, London for our children and their children and beyond.
Thank you. And it's been good to see, as I mentioned earlier, it's been good to see through this pandemic the way the boroughs have come together and the way that London government's tiers have come together, and indeed have been working with business. And I think you're right that that's something we need to continue building on. And in answer to the question from Waltham Forest in the Q&As, I think there probably isn't a tension between people working, staying in the boroughs and coming into the central activity zone. We need to look at different ways of using our great city, and I think that you know, we should view it as just a different way of working in the city rather than competition, I would suggest. Interestingly, before we got into the pandemic, I was talking to the leader, I was visiting the leader at Kingston, who was saying that it could be a benefit to the city if people worked from home a couple of days a week and used their own boroughs and then came in on other days. And I think what we've seen with the benefits of the flexible, well, the ability we all now have to work remotely, depending on the business we're in, if we can carry that on, we can see something that will work really well, you know, across borough boundaries.
Absolutely, I think that's interesting.
Okay, and actually on our climate action strategy, we're also writing out to all the boroughs where people have many, you know, really good initiatives on foot, just to talk about how we can complement, how our strategy can fit in with others. I do think putting that puzzle together will be really key. Sorry, John, do you want to come in with what you wish you'd been asked?
One, I think, really important area that underlies a lot of the recommendations we haven't really touched on is the diversity lens. And I think that becomes really important in terms of shaping where we're trying to get to, in terms of the ideas on a jobs fair, or really figuring out how to bring new talent into the workforce that may not have had these opportunities, some of the diversity targets, the teaching of digital skills. And to get that right, it's going to require involvement from all the different stakeholders around this, on the business, the public policy side, and the City of London using some of its convening power and influence to help really drive this. But I think that becomes really important to London being able to fulfill its potential.
Thank you for raising that. That's a really important point, and I'm glad you picked up on it. Giles.
The only thing I was going to add is, I think one of the things you'll see in the report is there's a real opportunity around how we use data and how the acceleration in people using technology to access public services has really increased. And I think there's potentially some really quite exciting short to medium term areas we could look at, so that London citizens are sort of accessing both, you know, commercial goods, but also their public services in a more efficient and more data-driven way. And I think that could be, you know, a potential real long-term win for all of us.
Thank you. And Martin.
Thanks, Catherine. I think one of the things that we haven't really talked about has been freight and the consolidation of freight and making that more environmentally cleaner and sustainable. Nick mentioned electric vehicles earlier, and I think it would be great to see a greater commitment across London to understanding freight and to make that to improve the way that it works, both for the drivers as well as for the people in the city, and the city with a lowercase c. We know that the city with an uppercase C has already been looking at that, and consolidation centres, developers in the city, AXA, British Land and others have been looking at the detail of this, but it's something that we're seeing across London. We know that the leader of Westminster City Council has been talking about it as well, and I'd like to see that sort of considered more holistically across London and across the sort of central and inner London boroughs.
Thank you very much. I know that's another great point, and there's one big asset that I think is underused these days, but was used for years and years by London to get around, and that is our river. And I think looking at greater use of our river for deliveries is something, and indeed for passenger use, is something that we're really keen to explore with partners, indeed already are exploring in the context of some developments out in East London, of which consolidating our 3 wholesale food markets is just a small part. So look, this has been a really great discussion. It's been really broad ranging. There's a lot more we could cover, whether it's the challenging question in the chat box around the amount of energy that we're using running servers for our virtual lives these days, and how do we reconcile that with sustainability. A really interesting question. A number of other really good points that have been made there. I'm very sorry that we haven't been able to tackle all of them, but I think it just shows how stimulating this report has been, and how much there is to explore as we take the recommendations forward. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to everybody who's joined us this morning for this launch. I'd like to thank you all for your excellent questions, and my apologies to those whose questions I didn't get round to posing. Thank you so much to our panel for taking us through the report's findings, and most importantly the recommendations, and thank you for your very thought-provoking views in response to the questions. So everybody will soon be receiving a link to the report, and I really encourage you to share it through your networks. The coming months are undoubtedly going to continue to be challenging for all of us, but it's also very clear as we look to the future that we have opportunities to build on the positive changes accelerated by the pandemic, opportunities to make London an undisputed place to innovate and collaborate, and opportunities to support the economic recovery across the UK. So we really look forward to working with our London and UK partners to ensure that we emerge from this difficult period better and stronger than ever. The city, with its long history, has seen disasters come and go and has come out of them better. This current challenging situation is, I think, another opportunity for us to show that spirit, as I say, working together with our partners. So thank you all very, very much. Ending 4 minutes early, so you have time for a cup of tea before your next meeting, and please keep in touch and let us have any feedback, and thanks once again to everybody who worked on this report. Thank you.